Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. In today's segments, we're going to hear from the NDP opposition in Alberta. We're also going to hear from Jagmeet Singh as he's answering questions to the press about the motion that he put on the floor to remove the special advisor for the interference into the electoral process in Canada. And we're going to hear some statements about, of course, the wildfires, and Justin Trudeau is going to reinforce that we don't need a public inquiry into the interference into the Canada electoral process. So let's focus on the Canada electoral process. And the real problem isn't so much that it may be safe now, but does the public believe that it is safe? And with that, if the public doesn't believe it is safe, we're going to see fewer and fewer voter turnouts, and it will have an effect on how our government processes work in electing officials and decision making that is turned out to a vote and then come back again. That who is actually going to benefit from this? You know, it could be China, of course, or it could be some other foreign government, since everybody strongly, at this point, is strongly suspecting it's China. Or is it some other factor that's already in Canada that holds some corporate clout in our society? We need to strongly look into that. And thus the need for a public inquiry. So Jagmeet Singh is possibly correct in demanding and in putting a motion on the floor that would ensure that public inquiry will happen. He's talking about how he's going to put pressure on the Liberal government to ensure that public inquiry happens into what is actually happening, not only with the electoral process, but also in the withholding of information that certain MPs were under surveillance by a foreign power. These things do actually need to be looked into. They do need to be reported, and we need to do the things necessary and gather the information necessary in order to keep our government safe, and the things that make Canada the country that it is, in order to keep them safe, they need to be looked at. So why don't we listen to today's show and you decide and make a voice to whoever your local MP is about keeping government safe so that we can vote and know that our vote is being heard.
Canadians still have confidence in David Johnston if all other parties in the House say they don't have confidence in him?
It's understandable that the political parties want to make partisan points on this, but the fact of the matter is David Johnston has served this country in extraordinary capacities for decades. He's chosen a number of times for the most important jobs by Stephen Harper himself. He's a man who, as the report shows, has taken this incredibly seriously and gathered all the intelligence necessary. What we've highlighted is that intelligence is available for the leaders of the opposition parties to avail themselves of, to understand what underpins the very good report that Mr. Johnston put out, and the fact that they're choosing to be able to continue to play partisan games instead of getting read into the actual facts of the matter shows that they're not taking
il y aura un vote finalement dit ça semble pas assez. Il y aura donc une majorité de députés qui vont dire on n'a pas confiance en ce monde, en ce monsieur. J'aimerais savoir pour vous, est-ce que ça change quelque chose, cette majorité qui n'aurait pas confiance?
On sait très bien, on a entendu très clairement que les partis d'opposition veulent et voulaient une enquête publique. Et c'est d'ailleurs une chose qu'on avait demandé à David Johnston, consulte les experts, regarde la situation, comprend ce qui est en train de se passer et détermine la meilleure façon de donner confiance et de donner confiance aux Canadiens dans notre système électoral. Parce que, par exemple, on sait que les élections en 2019-2021 n'ont pas été compromis malgré les efforts de la Chine. Ça, on le sait. Donc, est-ce qu'une enquête publique serait la meilleure façon de restaurer la confiance? Et M. Johnston, qui lui-même dit il pensait au début que oui, peut-être ce serait la bonne chose, a découvert et a conclu que non, ça ne l'était pas.
That would like to see a public inquiry. Dan Stanton, former CSIS member, was before committee yesterday. He says a public inquiry is required to restore confidence in institutions. Why ignore his word and go with Johnston?
We didn't appoint Dan to be the expert looking at this. We looked at a whole bunch of different people who we would task with this job. Of course, everyone is allowed to have opinions, regardless of their background. What we're looking for is what is the best path forward, and that's exactly what we entrusted this former Governor General with, who has a stellar reputation and level of integrity, to actually look and write this report. And you will notice that the opposition parties are not emphasizing any disagreements with the actual report or conclusions, particularly because they refuse to get the necessary briefings that are being offered to them to be able to understand and accept or disagree with those conclusions. They're continuing to do ad hominem attacks, personal attacks against David Johnston.
On peut être intègre, et au niveau de la perception, c'est juste pas la bonne personne et ça fait mal et à lui, et à vous, et à la crédibilité du rapport, et à la confiance du public. Dans votre réflexion, est-ce que ça joue?
Oui, ça joue, évidemment, mais ce qu'on est en train de voir, c'est que particulièrement l'approche qu'a choisi M. Poilievre et d'un certain niveau M. Blanchet rend la situation extrêmement toxique et le rendrait, quelle que soit la personne qu'on choisirait. Il y a un désir de ne pas prendre l'enjeu d'ingérence étrangère au sérieux, ce qui est évident par le fait qu'ils ne veulent même pas se faire donner les renseignements et l'analyse experte qui est sous-jacente pour savoir qu'est-ce qui s'est vraiment passé. Ils choisissent à la place de faire des attaques personnelles.
Pas de pas nommer quelqu'un choisi par le Parlement. Il n'y en aurait pas d'attaque à ce moment-là.
Le Parlement va continuer de faire son travail, mais de dire, chaque fois qu'on a demandé, par exemple, on avait demandé à M. Poilievre de nous donner des recommandations, suggérer des noms pour le rapporteur spécial. Il n'a même pas partagé un nom. Il n'a pas voulu dire, ah non, il n'a pas voulu. Non, écoutez, honnêtement, on sait très bien que M. Poilievre ne veut pas prendre ça au sérieux. Il cherche tout simplement des endroits à attaquer sur le dos de notre démocratie, sur le dos de l'ingérence chinoise. Nous, on va continuer de faire le travail de façon sérieuse et responsable. Si je peux, je voulais commencer avec ça, mais vous m'aviez fait répondre à des questions d'abord. I'd like to first take a moment to express our tremendous shock and awe and empathy for people across the country, particularly in the Atlantic provinces right now, who are being affected by wildfires. The images that we've seen coming out of Alberta and the Northwest Territories over the past weeks, the stories and the images we're seeing coming out of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are heartbreaking. We know people are extremely, extremely distressed by what's going on. As a federal government, we are there. We will be there to support. Minister Blair is regularly engaged. Our local MPs are active on the ground as much as possible. We've actually asked the Public Service to give technical updates to all party leaders so that they can know exactly what's going on, what our response is, and contribute more ideas and things that we can do on top of it. We're continuing to look at ways for all Canadians to be able to support people who are suffering through these devastating forest fires, and we'll continue to be there for people. Je veux exprimer d'abord mes sympathies et mon appui pour les gens à travers le pays qui sont en train d'être affectés par les feux de forêt. On l'a vu depuis des semaines en Alberta, au territoire du Nord-Ouest. On le voit maintenant en Nouvelle-Écosse et au Nouveau-Brunswick. Les images sont terribles. On est là pour les gens. On s'est engagé en termes de gouvernement. Le ministre Blair est dessus. Les forces armées sont engagées. J'ai aussi offert que la fonction publique donne des mises à jour techniques aux chefs des partis d'opposition sur ce qu'on est en train de faire par rapport aux feux de forêt pour que tout le monde puisse travailler ensemble parce que c'est un moment où tout le monde veut être là les uns pour les autres.
I'll keep a very short opening. We have a motion today. We want to see all members of this House support our motion, calling for Mr. Johnson to be remove the special rapporteur and to have a public inquiry. On a une motion aujourd'hui. On espère qu'on peut convaincre tous les membres de la Chambre de voter en faveur de notre motion pour enlever M. Johnson et aussi pour lancer une enquête publique. Je suis prêt pour vos questions. I'm ready for your questions.
M. Trudeau a dit que j'avais demandé...
Yeah.
What happens if the motion passes, but the government doesn't do what the motion says? They keep David Johnson there. What are the consequences? Are there any?
Well, first of all, the consequences are Canadians going to see that that the Prime Minister is no longer putting the interests of the country in front of his own personal interests. There's really no reason now to continue with Mr. Johnson when it's become very clear that this is nothing personal about Mr. Johnson or his credibility, but the appearance of bias is too strong that it undermines the work that the Prime Minister hoped that Mr. Johnson would be able to do. So it would show that he's no longer putting the interest of really restoring confidence of democracy, and he's more interested in protecting a position that he's taken, which no longer makes sense.
If this passes, is there any way for Mr. Johnson to continue?
I believe strongly, and I've said this before, I believe that Mr. Johnson is absolutely an honorable person. If he sees that the will of the House is for him not to continue, I believe he will take that as a clear message that he can't continue to do his work, and he'll step down. That's still something that I believe.
Ça vous fait quoi d'entendre M. Trudeau aujourd'hui dire, peu importe ce que la Chambre va décider, lui, son choix est fait, il va continuer?
Je pense que c'est une erreur. On n'est pas d'accord avec la position du Premier ministre. On a dit depuis le début que la décision d'avoir un rapporteur spécial, c'était une mauvaise décision parce qu'on a dit on a toujours dit qu'on a besoin d'une enquête publique. Et le processus d'une enquête publique pour rétablir la confiance de notre système électoral, on continue d'avoir cette position. C'est un désaccord. On n'est pas d'accord avec le Premier ministre. On va continuer de mettre la pression sur M. Trudeau de faire les bonnes choses.
Mr. Singh, your motion doesn't say do this or else, so he just continues to ignore you.
Well, this is our tools that we have. We are going to continue to put pressure on the Prime Minister, put pressure on the Liberal government, much like we put pressure on the government in the past to bring in dental care. They said no 2 years ago. We kept on fighting. We kept on pushing. They said no twice 2 years ago. They teamed up with the Conservatives to oppose it, and now kids under 12 have dental care, and seniors will get it by the end of this year. So
He's ignoring you.
this is what's happened in the past. We've fought for things, and the Liberals have not wanted to do it. The Conservatives have teamed up with them in the past. We're going to keep on pushing. We're going to keep on fighting.
Possibly continue to support the government if they do not agree with your motion. You just said he would have put the country's interest behind his own. How can you continue to support him then?
Well, let's look at that. We've got an agreement where there's 27 things that this government has to do to help Canadians. If we move away from that agreement, we're going to let the Liberals off the hook. The Liberals don't want to do these things. They didn't want to bring in dental care. They don't want to bring in pharmacare. They don't want to bring in protections for workers. They don't want to do any of these things. So if we get rid of the agreement, it's just going to let the Liberals off the hook. I'm not going to let them off the hook. We force them to commit to these things. We're going to make sure they follow through on these things. They would love to get out of this agreement so they don't have to deliver on pharmacare and dental care. We're going to continue to push to deliver the things that Canadians need because Canadians need a break.
Monsieur Singh, Monsieur Trudeau nous a dit tout à l'heure, j'ai consulté les partis d'opposition pour obtenir des noms en vue de nommer le rapporteur spécial et vous n'en avez fourni aucun. Un, est-ce que c'est vrai? Et deux, pourquoi?
C'est vrai, parce qu'on a dit, quand on a été consulté, que notre position, c'est la mauvaise chose à faire. On a besoin d'une enquête publique, pas un rapporteur spécial. Si on a donné un nom, ça veut dire qu'on accepte le processus, on pense que c'est une bonne chose à faire. On donne un nom, c'est une sorte de oui, on est d'accord. Mais non, on n'était pas d'accord. On maintient cette position, qu'on n'est pas d'accord avec l'idée d'avoir un rapporteur spécial. I'll give Bryce a quick question.
Okay,
and then
sure.
Deadline to accept the terms of your motion if it passes.
We're saying that they should, and this is the will of the House. I'm hoping that it does pass. This will be the will of the House. And I think that Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, continues to be on the wrong side of this issue, has shown a failure to recognize how serious this is, and he would be on the wrong side and have to answer to Canadians. But we are going to put this out there. This is the will of the House. I'm hoping Mr. Johnson does see this message clearly, and the Prime Minister does, and does the right thing.
Le Bloc et les conservateurs font un climat toxique à la Chambre. Êtes-vous d'accord avec ça?
On essaie de montrer du leadership. Donc, dans tout ce qui se passe dans la Chambre, dans ce qui se passe avec l'ingérence étrangère, notre but était toujours de montrer un chemin à suivre qui est responsable, qui est mature. Et donc, on n'a pas attaqué M. Johnson personnellement. On n'a jamais fait ça parce qu'on ne pense pas que c'est une bonne chose à faire. Ce n'est pas quelque chose de constructif. Ce qu'on a fait à ce moment, on a montré, oui, c'est clair qu'il y a une apparence de partialité qui n'est pas tenable. Donc, notre approche était une approche constructive.
Le climat est-il toxique ou pas?
Je pense que notre approche est constructive et les autres partis, vous devez poser la question à eux. Mon avis, c'est notre approche est la meilleure approche. Notre approche est une approche responsable, mature et constructive. Et je ne peux pas dire la même chose pour l'approche des autres partis.
Can I just ask you, the government is asking the RCMP to offer more protection to cabinet ministers and senior government officials. What do you think about the fact that this is even necessary?
I think it is disturbing. It is concerning. One of the things that is maybe a highlight of Canadian politics is the accessibility that people have with ministers, with elected officials. People are in public and can be approached in public. I think that's a positive thing. There's certainly a climate of aggression that from a fringe or a small group of people, but a climate of aggression that has made that public appearance more difficult. I particularly think about vulnerable members of parliament. I think about people that are more likely to be targeted or more vulnerable if they are targeted. And that's not the climate we want to have in politics. We want people to feel that they should enter into this field if they want to, and they are not going to receive violence or threats against them personally. People can disagree, and that's normal, but not to see that level of violence where people feel the need to have security. That is a troubling trend that we're noticing.
C'est un dialogue de sourds en ce moment entre vous, les partis d'opposition, et M. Trudeau. Il ne veut pas d'enquête publique, il ne veut pas faire démettre M. Johnston. Vous voulez une enquête publique, vous voulez qu'il s'en aille. L'enjeu, au cœur de tout ça, c'est la sécurité nationale. On fait comment pour faire avancer ça, pour améliorer la sécurité nationale au pays?
Ça, c'est vraiment la question primordiale. Dans notre avis, ça, c'est pourquoi on a besoin d'une enquête publique, parce que je pense que ça, c'est la vraie façon, une façon non partisane, parce qu'on a un chemin.
C'est là où je veux en venir, c'est un dialogue de sourds. Vous demandez ça, il dit non. Vous redemandez ça, il dit non. Une fois qu'on a fait ce dialogue-là pendant 3 semaines, 2 mois, peu importe combien de temps ça va durer, on fait quoi maintenant? Parce qu'il n'y en a pas d'amélioration en ce moment.
Donc, je suis d'accord qu'il y a une impasse ici. On pense que c'est quelque chose de vraiment sérieux. On propose des solutions matures, responsables et sérieuses, d'avoir une enquête publique, d'enlever M. Johnson à cause de l'apparence de partialité. Mais on a toujours des autres outils. On peut continuer d'avoir des témoignages dans le comité. Je pense que ce n'est pas la meilleure façon parce qu'il y a une partisanerie dans le comité qui n'est pas tout le temps constructif, mais c'est toujours un outil et on va continuer d'utiliser les outils qu'on a pour avancer la question de comment on peut renforcer notre démocratie, protéger notre sécurité nationale.
Monsieur Singh, avez-vous commencé le processus pour la cote de sécurité? Parce que du côté du bureau du premier ministre, ils m'ont dit qu'ils ont dit, du moins verbalement apparemment, qu'ils sont d'accord avec ce que vous demandez. Alors, est-ce que là, à ce point-ci, vous attendez quoi, là? Vous en êtes rendez-vous?
On a reçu le même signal, mais on attend la réponse écrite dans une lettre. Et puis, on est prêt de prendre les étapes nécessaires. On est prêt, on attend la réponse du gouvernement. Mais on est prêt et je suis tout à fait confiant qu'on va aller pour recevoir l'information rapidement.
Si vous lisez les documents et comme M. Johnson l'a écrit dans son rapport, lui s'attendait, il a écrit qu'il s'attendait à recommander une enquête publique, qu'il a été convaincu du contraire. Est-ce que vous êtes ouvert à la possibilité que vous pourriez être convaincu du contraire, comme lui a écrit l'avoir été?
Je pense qu'il y avait un témoignage hier qui m'a donné un plus de confiance que c'était une ancienne, quelqu'un qui travaille dans le bureau d'intelligence et il a dit qu'il y a des moyens de garder notre information secrète. On peut le faire. Et elle a témoigné que c'est tout à fait possible. Et elle est aussi d'accord qu'on a besoin d'une enquête publique. Donc, je pense, à cause de ce témoignage, c'est une opinion d'un expert qui dit que oui, c'est tout à fait possible d'avoir une enquête publique, que je pense que je vais maintenir ma position, mais je vais voir les documents et on verra c'est quoi le résultat de tout ça. Et j'ai hâte de partager ce que je peux en respectant les lois et respectant la sécurité nationale, mais j'ai hâte de partager mon opinion après j'ai vu les documents. Merci. Merci.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining for what is an important update in the continuing response to the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendations. Before I share the microphone with my colleague, the Public Safety Minister, Marco Mendicino, thank you, Marco, by the way, for being here with us today. I just want to offer a few thoughts on the ongoing emergency situation in my home province of Nova Scotia. By this time, you'll all be aware that communities across our province are ablaze. The reality is that the number of people displaced is approaching 20,000 as we speak. There are hundreds of homes that have been damaged and are at risk of being destroyed as a result of the wildfires that continue to impact Nova Scotia. Over the past few days, we've been doing what we can to make resources available to respond within our areas of jurisdiction, including aerial surveillance from Transport Canada. There are Coast Guard helicopters that are en route to the scene to assist now, comfort trailers for crew, and a number of other measures, whether you look at extending the fishing season for harvesters who've been impacted, and will, of course, be looking to continue to cooperate. Within the last hour, we have received a request for further assistance from the province of Nova Scotia. We are coordinating across all departments to identify how and to the extent we can continue to provide support. As the Prime Minister said over the past few days, the federal government is going to be there to answer positively to the requests of Nova Scotia and to Nova Scotians. Our priority is to help keep people safe during this emergency. A quick thought, for those who have friends, neighbours or family members who are impacted, look out for one another right now. These are challenging times, and to the first responders who are on the scene, we are so lucky to have your services. To keep people safe during an emergency like this is something I am so grateful for. To the extent anyone in Nova Scotia has an opportunity to say thank you to the first responders who are on the scene, please take advantage of the opportunity to do so. These are heroes living amongst us in our communities that are saving lives. Folks, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Minister Mendicino, to share an important update on making good of some of the recommendations from the Mass Casualty Commission. Marco, please.
Thank you, Sean. Merci. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. And before I do come to the substance of the announcement around an update on the implementation of the Mass Casualty Commission final report, I do want to echo the sentiments of Minister Fraser that the Government of Canada is working very closely with the Government of Nova Scotia to respond to the wildfires. I've been in touch with Premier Houston as well as my counterpart, Minister Brad Johns, on this. My colleague, Minister Bill Blair, is in very frequent contact with the government there. And of course, along with Sean and the rest of our colleagues from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, I beg your pardon, and all Canadians, our thoughts do go out to each and every one of you, and we will be there for you. And as we have been there for Nova Scotians at this very difficult time, it is important that we also acknowledge that this is shortly after the third anniversary of the awful and tragic shootings in Portapique in Nova Scotia in April of 2020. We know that it's been a little more than 3 years since then, but despite the passage of time, the trauma resulted in wounds, some plain to see, others beneath the surface, both equally felt by the community. Nous savons que le chemin de la guérison est long et nous devons faire tout ce qui est en notre pouvoir pour aider les familles à se remettre des pertes indicibles qu'elles ont subies. Le gouvernement du Canada fait sa part et s'engage à travailler avec le gouvernement de la Nouvelle-Écosse, les forces de l'ordre et tous les partenaires afin qu'une telle tragédie ne se reproduise plus jamais. Earlier this year, the Independent Mass Casualty Commission issued their final report, and I had the privilege of being present along with the Prime Minister, Minister Fraser, Premier Houston, as well as most especially the families who were impacted as the commissioners set out their findings. Their final report included numerous recommendations that would help to prevent and respond to similar incidents in the future, touching on police reforms that would strengthen, among other things, training, communications between police and government, emergency alert protocols, gun control laws, addressing domestic abuse and intimate partner violence, and relationship with Indigenous communities. The report sets out a critical path forward to reform the RCMP, reforms that are long overdue, and reforms that I want to be clear that I, in my capacity as the Minister of Public Safety, are committed to seeing through. To coordinate this effort, the Commissioner also recommended that the Government of Canada and Nova Scotia work together to establish an independent body to monitor both progress in advancing the important findings as well as being transparent with Canadians as we move forward. And today, in response to that recommendation, I am very pleased to announce, along with my Nova Scotia counterpart, Minister Brad Johns, that we are creating the Progress Monitoring Committee and that retired Justice Linda Lee Oland will be appointed chair of that committee with an initial one-year mandate. Aujourd'hui, en réponse à cette recommandation, j'ai le plaisir d'annoncer avec mon homologue de Nouvelle-Écosse, le ministre Brad Johns, que nous créons le comité de suivi des progrès et que la juge à la retraite Linda Lee Oland sera nommée président de ce comité avec un mandat initial d'un an. One of Justice Oland's first responsibilities will be to consult with the representatives of organizations implicated in the final report issued by the Mass Casualty Commission's recommendations and findings, as well as with other individuals, partners, and organizations in order to identify a list of proposed PMC members, as we are calling it, by this July. So this will happen very, very quickly. The founding chair will also ensure that the work of the PMC, this is the body that Justice Oland will be leading, is guided by a trauma-informed and victim-centric approach. De manière plus générale, le juge Hollande jouera un rôle de premier plan dans le suivi de la mise en œuvre des conclusions de la Commission en favorisant les discussions et les relations, en assurant la liaison avec les provinces et les territoires, en dégageant un consensus et en recherchant des possibilités de soutenir le travail des gouvernements du Canada et de la Nouvelle-Écosse en vue de bâtir des communautés plus sûres. While the events of April 2020 are permanently etched in our collective memory, we have entered a new phase in our recovery. It is now up to the governments of Canada and Nova Scotia to take up the work outlined in the Commission's final report, to confront the tough questions that are posed in that final report, to work together with law enforcement, particularly the RCMP, to work with the families, the communities, the victims and the survivors, so that we can move forward. The Progress Monitoring Committee and Justice Oland are well positioned to ensure accountability and transparency on this front, and we very much welcome the next steps as well as the results of their work going forward. To all of the victims and survivors, friends and families of the Portapique and Truro shootings, and indeed all Nova Scotians, your pain will never be forgotten. No one should have ever had to endure the loss that you did during those awful 2 days in April 2020. We know that the wounds are still felt, but by making this next important step and appointing Justice Oland to champion the work of this committee, we will be able to see through the final report, address its recommendations, reform the RCMP, restore trust, and build confidence of Canadians in our law enforcement institutions so that this kind of tragedy never occurs again. Thank you. Merci.
Monsieur Mendicino, 3 partis d'opposition demandent le départ de David Johnston. Est-ce que la confiance du public ne commande pas qu'on lui demande de se retirer et qu'on trouve quelqu'un?
Malgré les attaques partisanes sur M. Johnston, je suis confiant que la qualité de ses recommandations évoquait un parcours pour l'avenir et ce parcours incluait des séances publiques. Et ça, c'est exactement ce que nous sommes dévoués de faire parce qu'avec un engagement avec des Canadiens et Canadiennes, on peut renforcer les protections pour nos institutions démocratiques, on peut renforcer la confiance des Canadiens à tout l'établissement de sécurité nationale.
Why not just appease the opposition parties and have a public inquiry?
This is not about appeasement. This is about doing the right thing. And what we have done since we have taken the reins of government is put in place the authorities that are necessary to protect Canadians from foreign interference. And it is the Conservatives who are engaging in the height of contradiction by saying one thing and frankly doing another. They say they want to be tough on foreign interference. They have voted against every single authority that our government, a Liberal government, has put into place. They say they want to lay to bear truth and facts. Mr. Poilievre continues to refuse to take the briefing. He should take the briefing.
But it's not just the Conservatives, it's the Bloc, it's the NDP, they all want a public inquiry, and today the NDP has put forward this motion calling for Johnston to step aside. So clearly there's unanimity there that the opposition parties want a public inquiry and they don't think that Johnston is the person to lead this path forward.
We're going to work with Mr. Singh. He has said that he is prepared to take a briefing. We're going to work with all parliamentarians. But the first step has to be to equip oneself with the facts. And we have said repeatedly now for more than a week that we are prepared to provide Mr. Poilievre with the same access that Mr. Johnston had to classified information. And for reasons that pass understanding, he refuses to take the briefing.
The government stepping up protection, RCMP protection from ministers and top bureaucrats?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Is your government stepping up RCMP protection from ministers and top bureaucrats? threats and other things that they're facing?
Yes, we've been vigilant about that. We've put into place a number of new protections, including providing panic buttons for parliamentarians, making sure that parliamentarians have a rapid response mechanism with information and support. This requires a community of law enforcement branches, including right here on the Hill, working closely with the Sergeant at Arms, as well as the Parliamentary Police Service. So we will continue to be vigilant because, quite frankly, the threat landscape as it pertains to not only elected parliamentarians, but the people that work in our constituency offices, the people that work on the front lines, and I would say disproportionately women, disproportionately racialized Canadians, disproportionately Indigenous peoples. They are the ones who have to be at the center of our work on this, and we will continue to add more to it.
Mass Casualty Commission.
I can't hear you all at the same time.
The RCMP called for, the Mass Casualty Commission called for sweeping reforms to the RCMP, overhauling, taking a new look at contract policing, changing depot training and completely eliminating it. Are you committing now to taking those steps or only to think about taking those steps?
No, we're going to take the steps, and in my job as Minister of Public Safety, I am driving those reforms. We have made progress on a number of fronts, but what the Mass Casualty Commission final report makes abundantly clear is that there is still a long way to go on each of the critical areas that you have identified. What we have done today is put in place a respected, retired jurist in Justice Oland, who herself is a resident of Nova Scotia, with deep community roots, with an understanding of how these reforms can be taken from what are words on a page and translated into a reality that will mend trust and reform the RCMP is how we can build confidence.
And training at Depot, just to be clear here.
To be clear, I want to make sure that we do that work with Justice Oland and the other members of that committee who will be appointed in very short order. But what I have said is that this is a report that is the product of many, many months of work. In fact, more than a couple of years, who have heard from a wide range of expert witnesses. And the fact is that we do have to take a hard look at how it is that new members of the RCMP are being trained. We've got to take a look at the way in which we can restore trust with Indigenous communities. I mean, we have here Jaime Batiste, and we had a very good conversation within the last couple of months in Escazone about how that trust has to be not only restored but strengthened. Some of the recommendations touch on that, particularly around training, and I'm going to keep a very open mind about what recommendations will be implemented with the guidance and the advice of a very respected former jurist in Justice Oland.
Out of 130 recommendations, those that fall to you, those that fall to the federal government, are you saying yes, we're going to implement all of those, or are there some that you know that you cannot cross that line, that you will not be able to implement?
I'm not striking out the possibility of excluding any of them. But I do think it is important to underline that we have already moved on a number of concrete recommendations. Let's take one very practical one, emergency responses. As painful as it was over those 2 days, we have taken some lessons. And the RCMP are making progress in better leveraging social media, being public about where emergencies manifest so that we can keep Canadians informed about how to take practical steps to protect themselves. There are other recommendations that are already being implemented, and we're going to have more of a concrete update in the very short term about that. But I'm not saying no to any recommendations. I think it's the opposite. I think we have to be as open to implementing as many of these recommendations as we possibly can, as quickly as we can. And I've had a very direct conversation with Commissioner Duhaime, who, as you know, just completed the changing of the guard, and I know that he is committed to seeing this work through as well.
You're not announcing anything today, anything concrete or specific that would have stopped Gabriel Wortman from going on a shooting spree. There's nothing specific you're announcing today.
Well, that's actually not correct. The announcement of Justice Oland is a significant step because she will be part of the implementation and accountability body that will help to ensure the follow-through on the 130 recommendations. But let me come back to some of the other substantive progress that we have made. In addition to the emergency alerting improvements that the RCMP have made, recommendation C.21 of the final report suggested that the government strengthen the national ban against AR-15 assault-style firearms. We have acted on that recommendation by including a new technical definition, which just recently passed in this House by a voting margin of 2-1. So from where we were from a few months ago to where we are now is a significant stride forward in putting in place stronger gun controls that will help to reduce the likelihood and the risk of another mass shooting strategy. And that is the fundamental difference between what Canadians get with a Liberal government who sees the value of putting in place strong gun controls and what you get with Mr. Poilev's Conservatives, who would repeal all of this legislation and make AR-15 style firearms legal again.
Rachel also said there are some aspects of RCMP management culture that are so bad, you can't wait for more reports. It has to be dealt with probably by September. Are you going to be able to meet that kind of time frame?
And I think that is a very fair question, and I am very cognizant of the fact that there are numerous recommendations that have recommended a path forward to reform the RCMP, and that is why it is so vital that we put in place Justice Oland and other members of the community and experts to follow through on the recommendations. The RCMP is at a crossroads, and what is important is that to mend trust, we have to implement these recommendations. Now, the Government of Canada is acting decisively and concretely already, and I have given two very specific examples in ways that will reduce the possibility of another mass shooting. But we need to work closely with the RCMP. We need to work closely with the Government of Nova Scotia. We need to work very closely with the families who are at the very center of this work so that we can, again, mend trust and build the confidence of Canadians.
The longer that you take to, first of all, decide what recommendations you're taking and then get into the process of doing them, that Canadians are not vulnerable to another mass casualty situation. We have a tragedy, we have recommendations, and then there's a long bureaucratic process before anything really gets decided. What is going to be different in this case?
Well, Rachel, we've already acted on two very critical recommendations, so that shows that
so long to decide on which other ones you will or won't do.
That shows our government's commitment to take action even before we set up this committee. But the reason why we are making this announcement today is because the Mass Casualty Commission had processed very much a part of the strategy to follow through with these recommendations. And so by appointing Justice Oland and by quickly populating the rest of that committee, we're going to be able to accelerate the progress that I think that your question cuts the heart of. I'm sorry?
What are we supposed to take from you waiting until the deadline day to make this announcement?
Well, first, we wanted to be sure that we got the selection right, and there were very important conversations that we had with the Government of Nova Scotia. I also think, in fairness to the families, we wanted to socialize some of the options that we had, including Justice Oland. As I said, she is herself a Nova Scotian resident. She is a respected jurist. She sat on the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. She sat on the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. And so bringing the community along was part of the reason why we had to take the time to get this right. But now that we have appointed her as a chair, and I can assure you, as you heard in my remarks, that we are going to be filling other members on that committee very quickly by July, that we'll be able to make even a more accelerated progress on all of the recommendations.
Already, like my colleague asked a question about whether or not you're going to implement those RCMP reforms we discussed, and it kind of sounded like you were deferring to this new justice you've appointed. Are you going to close the depot? Are you going to take those actions, or are you going to wait until she's appointed and defer to whatever decision she makes? That's not really her job. It sounds like it's about implementing them. So can we get a firm commitment that everything the report has recommended is going to get done?
Even as you pose that question with its urgency, and I understand why it's such a significant decision, because for the benefit of those who don't know, a depot is the main recruitment and training academy before you become a Mountie. It is a significant decision. And what the final report maps out is the fundamental principles and building blocks by which we can take a more evidence and research-based approach to modernizing that training. And in order to do that, you have to work with various communities, including the First Nations and Indigenous communities that are in Nova Scotia, that are right across the land. And so one of the touchstones has to be proper consultation as we make the significant reforms that are necessary to the RCMP. But I am absolutely committed to seeing it through, and I'm absolutely committed to moving as quickly as we possibly can, but in the right way.
Last question, Federal Appeals Court that the government does not have to repatriate 4 Canadian men
who were accused of being part of ISIS. Does the government see this decision from the court as a win? What is your reaction to this? Because you've been challenging this.
Well, obviously the decision will be absorbed by the government. Our priority first and foremost is to make sure that we safeguard the country and our borders from any potential terrorist activity. And as we said to anybody who may have been traveling abroad for terrorist purposes, that is against the law. There will be consequences for that. At the same time, we are also have also undertaken a process and a framework by which there can be decisions taken around repatriation, but it has to be done in accordance with the principle of law, and we'll have more to say as we absorb that decision. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Good morning, bonjour à tous. Je suis Charlie Angus. Wache, Kwe, we're on here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm here this morning with Gil McGowan of the Alberta Federation of Labour. Over the last year, we have been working closely with the union movement across Canada and in particularly with the energy workers in the West on pushing this government to get serious about making commitments in a clean tech future. Alberta energy workers have the skills and the know-how to make this happen, and they want to be at the table. According to the International Energy Agency, for the first time, clean tech investments are almost double what it is in oil and gas. If Canada doesn't start to make a serious commitment to move forward, we are going to be left with stranded assets and communities left out. The New York Times this morning is reporting an unprecedented jump in clean tech energy and battery plant production within 9 months of Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act coming into law, and Canada risks being left behind unless we move decisively. In the recent federal budget, we did see some very impressive promises for clean tech, but those promises are just words unless there's the legislative tools to ensure that this is a worker-focused transformation that is not going to leave communities behind. We are calling for a number of elements that have to be in this legislation. The Sustainable Jobs Council must include representation from labor. Labor has to be at the table. We want clear definition of the role, mandate, reporting requirements of the Sustainable Jobs Secretariat. It's a great sounding word. What is it? And how do we ensure that investments that are being offered will come with the strings attached, that will have involvement from labor, from Indigenous communities, and from the regions of Canada to make sure that we benefit and that the expertise that is being brought forward through the energy workers are able to help direct this transformation of the global economy. We have one chance to do this right, and we cannot fail. Le monde fait face à une crise climatique, mais en même temps, il y a une transformation de l'économie énergétique mondiale. C'est nécessaire pour le Canada de jouer un rôle important dans la transformation mondiale vers l'énergie durable. Les travailleurs de l'énergie de l'Ouest sont prêts de saisir l'occasion. Je suis ici ce matin avec Gil McGowan, président de la Fédération du travail de l'Alberta. Les travailleurs d'Alberta demandent à ce gouvernement de mettre en place les législations nécessaires pour garantir que les investissements dans l'énergie propre profiteront aux communautés et aux travailleurs. Les travailleurs de l'énergie veulent être à la table de décision. Ils ont l'expertise pour faire de la transformation une réalité et ils ont le droit de protéger les intérêts des travailleurs et des régions du Canada. I'll turn it over to Gil McGowan.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks for joining us this morning. On Monday, we narrowly elected or re-elected a climate change denying government in Alberta. This isn't just bad news for the environment, it's also bad news for the Alberta economy and for Alberta workers. It's bad news for workers and the economy because change is coming whether we like it or not. We can either be prepared for that change or we can be run over by it. The UCP, under our Premier Daniel Smith, unfortunately is choosing the latter. They're choosing to stick their heads in the sand. They're choosing denial over preparation. They're choosing to hold our province back while the world moves forward. And all Albertans, including Alberta workers, will pay a price. But it doesn't have to be that way. The world is in the early stages of what can only be described as the biggest economic paradigm shift since the Industrial Revolution. That shift is happening because citizens, businesses, and governments around the world are increasingly recognizing that climate change is an existential threat to humanity. This realization is driving action. The vast majority of governments on the planet have committed to move towards a net zero economy, and industry is following suit with their investment decisions. Last summer, the Biden administration turbocharged this process by embracing a nationwide industrial policy aimed at pivoting the American economy towards new opportunities in the net zero economy. The key word for us is opportunities. The unfolding global energy transition has huge implications for oil and gas producing jurisdictions like my home province of Alberta, but it also presents unprecedented opportunities for investment, job creation, and continued prosperity. That's why the labor movement in Alberta, representing workers in both oil and gas-related construction and manufacturing, came together last fall to produce a blueprint for an alternative economy in Alberta. We called it Skating to Where the Puck is Going, and it outlined 6 priorities for changing the Alberta economy and pivoting towards continued prosperity in a changing world. First, in that report, we told anyone who would listen, including our provincial government and the federal government, that in this unfolding energy transition, the priority has to be jobs, not just labor market adjustment for people who might lose their jobs in this transition, but the creation of good jobs that will sustain families and communities. Second, we said that we had to put a priority on embracing the idea of industrial policy because change will not come just by itself. It has to be intentional. And that intention has to be embraced and supported by governments here in Canada at both the federal and provincial level. Third, we said our governments and our industry have to put their money where their mouth is. Fourth, we said that when it comes to providing assistance and incentives for industry to make this transition, governments have to attach strings to the money that they provide as incentives. And fifth, we said that this has to be a whole economy and whole a government effort, which is an important point because as we discovered with dealing with bureaucracy in Alberta and increasingly with our experiences with bureaucracy in government, there are too many silos that have to be broken down in order to make the change that needs to happen at the scale and the speed that it has to happen. And sixth and finally, we said that in order for the change that we're proposing to make sure that it improves lives for everyone, workers have to be at the table. Not just as an afterthought, we have to be there from the beginning. We have to participate in decision-making to make sure that the changes don't just help business, but they actually help the working people who are going to be at the front of this change. This morning, I just want to say that my interactions on behalf of our workers in Alberta have been constructive with the federal government. Over the last year and a half, we've had very productive discussions with key ministers, including Minister Wilkinson in Natural Resources, Minister O'Regan in Labour, and also Minister Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, and Minister of Finance. They have met with us in good faith. They have taken our recommendations seriously, and I'm very pleased to say that a lot of the work that we set out to do with the federal government has been done. Specifically, when we came to them last year and said that we needed the government to embrace the idea of transition with a focus on jobs as opposed to labor market adjustment, they accepted that recommendation. So their priority is creating new jobs and seizing new opportunities to create new prosperity, as opposed to just trying to pick up the pieces as change unfolds. Second, they embraced our notion that we should be embracing industrial policy as the goal to help facilitate this change. And then third, we asked that they put their money where their mouth is. And that's what we saw in the fall economic statement and in the recent budget. They earmarked $15 billion for incentives over the next 5 years that will help diversify the Canadian economy, especially the provincial economy in Alberta. And that money is going to escalate to about $80 billion over 10 years. What we asked them to do from the unions in Alberta representing workers in oil and gas-related construction, and oil and gas manufacturing, we said that we had to match the American government's ambition in terms of size and scale of their incentives. And with what was announced in the federal budget, we feel satisfied that they've done that. The fourth thing that they've done in good faith is listen to our suggestions on attaching strings to that money, specifically in order for companies to benefit from the full amount of the incentives. They have to, they've agreed to what we call labor conditions. So they, in order to get the full measure of the incentives, they have to pay a prevailing wage, which we're working with the federal government in good faith on to define what a prevailing wage is. And they also made a big commitment to make sure that we're training apprentices for the future of our trades. The work that's yet to be done, and that's why I'm in Ottawa today, has to do with the sustainable jobs legislation that the federal government has promised and which we are told will be introduced sometime in the next couple of weeks. We want, we've got the political commitment, we've got money on the table. Now we need a legislative framework to make sure that the job actually gets done. And so yesterday and today I've been meeting with senior bureaucrats and with political actors in the federal government to talk about what we in the Alberta Labour Movement would like to see in the sustainable jobs legislation. And basically that, what we're hoping is to see the remainder of our priorities. We've checked off a number of our priorities on our list, but what hasn't yet been seen is a framework that will facilitate a whole government effort to support investment and job creation in these new opportunities. So we need legislation that will make sure that we can break down these barriers between departments to make sure that ideas and money are flowing to where they need to go. And then we also need a labor seat at the table. So we need to create a framework for decision-making to make sure that, this work gets done. And we've made it clear that this transition can only happen with working people, especially workers in the most affected sectors, participating in the decision-making process, and that means from the get-go, not as an afterthought after decisions have already been made. As I said, we're very pleased with the discussions that we've had so far. The federal government is coming to the table to meet with us in goodwill, and we're confident that the legislation, when it's introduced, will be a big step towards the direction that we hope to see our country moving in terms of seizing the opportunities that are presenting themselves in as we pivot towards a net zero economy. I'm going to wrap up this morning by telling you what I'm worried about. With the re-election of a UCP government in Alberta, what I'm, as a representative for working people in our province, including people in oil and gas-related construction, and oil and gas-related manufacturing, I'm frankly terrified that our provincial government will make it more difficult for us to seize the opportunities that are in front of us in the unfolding global economy. And I'm also worried that they will hold us back so that we fail to seize the opportunities that are in front of us. And I say that because the UCP over the last 3 years, and especially in the lead up to our recent provincial election, has chosen to look at the issue of the global energy transition not as an issue about defending the public interest, but through a political lens, and they've tried to politicize a discussion that really should be about the public interest. So instead of preparing our economy and supporting incentives that will support job creation and allow us to prosper in a changing world, they've chosen to play politics. And one of the reasons I've flown here the day after our provincial election is because Alberta needs to engage with all partners at all levels, including the federal government, including business, to make sure that we don't get left behind as the global economy transforms. As I've said many times, this change is happening whether we like it or not. We can choose to prepare for it and prosper, or we can stick our heads in the sand and be left behind. And in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, in order to ensure that we actually seize these opportunities for prosperity that are in front of us, our provincial government has to engage with all the relevant partners. That includes the federal government. And so if they're not going to do that important work, then that will fall to other Albertans, including those of us in labor, those of us and our counterparts in business in Alberta. We'll have to have the conversations that our provincial government should be having. And if that's not my first preference, but I know that there are many Albertans of goodwill in the labor movement, in the business community, who will be engaging with the federal government on these important discussions, even if our provincial government refuses to. So with that, I'll just wrap up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
This may be a stupid question, but you're talking about the whole of government approach, breaking down barriers. This is one of the big things you want to see in the legislation. Can you just explain, like I'm five, of what you're talking about? What is this? What's wrong with sort of the system now around this, and exactly what needs to change? Just it's maybe a stupid question, but just
well, it's not a stupid question. Well, I'm going to answer this in two ways. First, I'm going to refer to some of the experience that we had under the previous Alberta government. Between 2015 and 2019, the New Democrats under Premier Rachel Notley were in charge in Alberta, and they responded to some of the concerns that we had raised in the labor movement about diversification and support for workers who are losing their jobs as a result of the coal phase out. And it became very clear to us that in order to get the kind of support that we needed from the provincial government at the time, we had to be talking to the right people. So when they announced the coal phase out, it was under the Environment Department, and jobs were being phased out, and a lot of those people were our members, and we ended up talking with people in the Environment Department who knew nothing about labor policy. And so it became very clear to us that when dealing with government, you got to talk to the right people for the challenge at hand, right? And so, that's why I say you got to break down barriers between departments, and that's true at the federal level as well. So, right now, the discussions on the sustainable jobs legislation are being led by the Natural Resources Minister, which is fine, but his department is not specialist in many of the other areas that we feel very strongly need to be part of the discussion. So, for example, the Labor Department has to be involved in the discussion because of their responsibility for labor markets. The Department of Employment and Skills Development has to be involved because of their responsibility for training, and then departments like industry have to be involved, and certainly the finance department needs to be involved. So that's why I say and traditionally, governments, whether it's provincial or federal level, don't have a great track record of always talking across silos. And that's why some kind of framework needs to be established in this legislation. I think there's an opportunity to do this with this legislation, to create a framework that will facilitate the discussions that need to happen between these different departments. And I don't want to cast dispersions. The people who work in each of these departments do great work. But because we're talking about such a big change over such a short period of time, and we're talking about the need to seize these opportunities and not be left behind, we can't let these silos and the bureaucracy stand in the way of us doing what needs to be done. So that's why I'm hoping that this legislation will create a framework that will allow the kind of communication, cross-pollination, and collaboration that's necessary between these different departments.
So if I understand,
I think they get it, and like in the conversations that I've been having with people from natural resources, labor, finance, industry, I think they understand that the status quo and the silos that exist in in and between the departments, there needs to be something done to break down those barriers in order for us to adequately prepare for the challenges in front of us.
recently we've heard, it was more out east in the Maritimes with tidal energy projects, but there was some concerns that federal regulations and sort of the system of approving certain projects was too onerous for the seize the moment speed imperative that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in this area it's a similar thing, that the culture of government, and it's maybe what you're talking about now, that the pace at which they make decisions is not appropriate for the task at hand or the climate crisis at hand and what needs to happen?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question because, like, during those 4 years when the New Democrats were in power in Alberta between 2015 and 2019, one of the things that Premier Notley did at the time was establish what they called the Energy Diversification Advisory Committee, which was a joint labor business advisory committee that put together recommendations about diversification in the Alberta economy. I was actually chosen as the labor co-chair, and there was another co-chair from business. And in our final report, one of the things that we suggested was an effort to speed the regulatory approval process for diversification projects. So that's something that you've heard from the business community. It's something that we in labor support. There are huge opportunities that are out there, but we are competing with other jurisdictions, including the United States south of the border. So if we don't put money on the table, if we don't speed the regulatory process for projects that can create jobs and get us to where we want to go in terms of diversification, we'll fall behind, right? So it makes I don't know if it sounds like it's a surprise coming from the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, but on this issue about speeding the regulatory process, we agree with our counterparts in business. In fact, one of the things that I repeat over and over again when I'm meeting with government officials, both at the provincial and federal level, is that when it comes to diversification in the Alberta economy, in order to pivot and seize opportunities in the net zero economy, the labor movement in our province is in many respects on the same page as the business community. And in my remarks, I mentioned that we had come together through the Federation of Labor with our energy, construction and manufacturing unions to produce an economic blueprint. We called it Skating to Where the Puck is Going, borrowing that famous phrase from Wayne Gretzky. And we released that last fall. But almost at the same time, similar reports were being released by the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, the Business Council of Alberta, and in the broad strokes, they were very similar. So even though we've just seen the re-election of a government that is essentially a climate-denying government, a government that refuses to have serious conversations about diversification, and a government that continues to stick its head in the sand in terms of seizing these opportunities for investment and job creation in the new economy. When people think of Alberta, they think of Daniel Smith and the UCP and their denialism. But the reality is that in Alberta right now, there's this amazing consensus that's being reached outside of the political sphere by people in business, people in labor, people in the broader community. We understand that change is coming, and that we need to prepare for it or run the risk of being left behind. That's what I'm hearing from my counterparts in unions in Alberta. It's what I'm hearing from business organizations, not incidentally, including the big oil sands companies represented through organizations like the Pathways Alliance. I guess that's one of the things I would encourage Canadians to understand is that when it comes to this unfolding global energy transition and the opportunities it presents, our currently re-elected UCP government is not actually representative of all Albertans. They've chosen to politicize these issues and demonize anyone who talks about preparing for transition, but the reality is that most Albertans are way ahead of our government on these important issues.
I've got a question for both of you, if that's all right. Just going back a bit to Budget 2023, you were talking about the labor requirements that were attached to those investment tax credits. This is my read, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would only apply to, the construction phase, not necessarily ongoing manufacturing and whatnot. I don't know, I guess, how do you assess the fact that wasn't part of the package? Like, was that a big loss to unions and the NDP both? Where do we go from there in terms of maybe attaching more strings to future programs outside of the just transition legislation or sustainable jobs?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and it is an issue that we raised quite vigorously with the federal government, and maybe just for the benefit of those who are watching, when the federal Liberals, let me put it, when the federal government introduced the budget for 2023 last year, they made a commitment to $15 billion in incentives to support investment in clean tech, hydrogen, carbon capture and sequestration, and they attach what they described as labor conditions to all of those investment incentives. And so in order to get the full benefit of those incentives, companies would have to commit to paying a prevailing wage, which is still being defined. And so we're working hard with finance officials to get a definition of prevailing wage that actually pulls as many people up as possible. And then they also have, in order to qualify for the full benefit of the incentives, they have to commit to training the next generation of tradespeople, which is important because a lot of big construction companies, especially the non-union companies, do not actually take on apprentices. They choose instead to poach from companies that do, who in most cases are unionized. And so that puts the unionized companies at a disadvantage, even though they play this hugely important role in terms of training the next generation. So we in the labor movement, we lobbied for those labor conditions. We got them, and we're very pleased. But as you said in your question, the way that they've been designed is that the labor conditions only apply to the construction phase of these new projects, and not the ongoing operation of these facilities. And so what we said during the lead up to the federal budget was that we wanted to see similar conditions attached to all phases of these projects, including once they went into operation. So whether it's like a manufacturing facility or or an oil and gas facility, we said that there should be conditions if they're going to get continued ongoing public support that would require that they pay a prevailing wage, hire apprentices, because this is not just an issue for the construction sector. So we were disappointed that they didn't extend the labor conditions beyond the construction sector. but this is still a live issue. And so we in the labor movement, through groups like the Alberta Federation of Labour, through our individual unions, through the Canadian Labour Congress, we're still bringing this conversation to the federal government. They haven't said no, but they haven't said yes. But they're still meeting with us to have these discussions. So we're hoping that we'll find a way to make sure that every company that gets public money to incent their projects will be required to pay their workers a decent wage, a prevailing wage, that they'll have requirements on training, and that these requirements will go beyond construction, that will apply to the companies who are getting these incentives, regardless of what stage of development they're at.
The issue of labor commitments, apprenticeship commitments, goes to the very heart of the negotiations that began on the SACA agreement between the Liberals and the Democrats, because we did point out to the government, the Prime Minister goes to COP26, makes all these big announcements, and Canada misses every single climate target they've ever made. Joe Biden goes to COP26 and says he's going to create a new economy based on good paying union jobs. And we said to the Liberals, we never heard that language from you guys. We've never heard that you are committed not just to meeting your global targets, but that you're looking to reassure Canadians that they are going to be part of a new economy. And that industrial policy vision was a huge hurdle. I mean, I'm going to say our Liberal friends are way outside their comfort zone on this. And we're going to get them a little further outside their comfort zone, because this is really important stuff. So when we heard that they were going to put labor conditions, that was really good. When they said they were going to put apprenticeships, that was also a good signal. But this is not over. This is why when we set up the Secretariat and the Jobs Partnership Council, Labor has to be at the table, so that we know that this isn't just nice words that ends up getting, projects offshored. This is words that are put into reality, and that reality is about creating a new energy economy where families are going to be able to know that there's a take-home pay at the end of the day, that there's going to be apprenticeships, that there's a better future for our communities. That's what the government has to reassure Canadian communities, regions, and workers for. So, yeah, as Gil says, this fight's far from done. We will say what we've got is we've got a flag in the field. Now we got to get to the past the finish line.
And what are the major sticking points in those discussions? Because I understand getting the construction requirements in first. That's going to be what's coming up first. I guess, where's the resistance coming from during those talks?
I think Gil pointed out initially, it's really, again, outside the comfort zone of government to come up with legislation that is cross departments. And getting them to understand, you can't just put legislation in and say you're going to transform the Canadian economy. That's ridiculous. That's a recipe for failure. And we've unfortunately seen a lot of failure. We saw what happened in the cod fishery. I come from Northern Ontario. I don't know how many of my mining communities have gone down with nothing except a little manpower center and a twilight economy. We're talking about a crisis. We're talking about an opportunity. And so getting government to understand all the way up through the Prime Minister's office and the PCO that this is not just going to be Minister Wilkinson over at NRCan, but this is going to be the Labour Minister. This is going to be environmental policy. This is going to be ESDC. We need them all working together, and we need them working with labor and communities. So there's a number of sticking points. I'm hopeful that when the legislation comes, we're going to see some areas of real transformation. This Sustainable Jobs Secretariat, what is it? What does it do? What is its mandate? What are the accountability mechanisms? What is the data that's being collected? Because if we don't have good data on where the jobs are, on where the opportunities, or where the losses are, we've got nothing. So we need language there that's very clear. On the Jobs Partnership Council, we want to know that there's going to be, again, co-chairs, and that Labour is one of those co-chairs, and that the government's not taking this as just some, little desk that's going to be in the minister's back office, but this is actually going to have a mandate to instruct government on where to go. So those are two key areas. There's a number of things on the Sustainable Jobs Plan. Nice words, talk about training, talk about upskilling. what is that going to look like, and how is it going to affect people in different parts of the country? Because the transformation is happening in various locales, in very different speeds right now. I think one of the reasons we work so closely with the Alberta Federation of Labour is there's nothing theoretical about this in Alberta. This is what's happening on the ground. So their expertise is really, really important. So we're optimistic we can get there, but we're moving a mountain. And we have to get that mountain moved very quickly in order to start catching up to where the Americans have already just gone way beyond what anybody thought could have been done. So the Americans have an all-of-government approach. We have to at least match that.
Questions? No questions online.
Maybe just one more quick one. If we can, don't want to take up your whole day here, but my understanding is in previous months, the NDP and maybe even the AFL was quite involved in discussing this with the government, even in the tent, if that's the right metaphor, in terms of crafting this. Has it been similar with the legislation? Like, how close are the talks around this? How involved are you guys?
I've been called a pain in the ass. I think that's a pretty good thing to be called. Let's just say we're about that far off them on their backs every day, all day into the evening, because we got to get this right, and we got one shot at it. So they're constructive. Let's say I would say they're constructive, but we really have to deliver. And there's going to be a lot of questions when this legislation comes forward, and we want to be able to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you for listening today. Some final thoughts. There's a lot of talk about, and we keep hearing more and more about gun control and how the mass shootings and things like that are a U.S. problem, but killings are not a U.S. problem. If you go and you seek out one of our documentaries, Hate Kills, you will find out that there are still movements in Canada that are just as armed as some of the militia groups that are responsible for mass shootings in the United States. Controlling magazines and number of bullets that can be loaded into a gun, that's a really good first step. Notice I said first step. We need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond gun control, and we need to move into hate control. We need to find those who perpetrate hate, and we need to retrain their minds. We need to find those who want to spread love and perpetuate it. We need to stop the hatred, because people don't kill people, guns don't kill people, hate kills. The sooner we come to the conclusion that we need to stop the hate and all the rest of it falls into place, the faster we will save lives. Gun control, a good first step. Let's get into the schools and start talking love so that we can end the hate. Okay, so you have been listening to Policy and Rights here in Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. The opinion you just heard is my opinion, and maybe not necessarily the opinion of everybody here at Depictions Media. But either way, for continued updates and to get more information, go to depictions.media and click on that subscribe button where it is on your screen. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.